Changing tack a little bit, question for Ed. So when we talk about public participation and who gets to decide where AI goes, there is actually a lot of existing work of which people on this panel have done as well about what people in general and public groups want to see happen. So in an Ada Lovelace Institute survey from last year of a representative sample of the UK population, where they were asked to rank what they perceived to be the highest benefit for AI application, the risk of cancer was ranked as the preferred highest perceived benefit, whereas something like driverless cars and quite obviously targeted political advertising were perceived as most concerning. But when you look at actual application of AI by industry, a 2022 report from the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport found that health services ranked as the lowest adopter of AI systems. So, Ed, what makes one industry more likely than another to adopt AI? But more specifically, how do you think that mismatch between the use of AI by industry and how the public want to see AI used can be addressed?
Yes, I mean, I'll start off with maybe a slightly flippant statement, but it turns out science is really hard. You know, I think it's one of the reasons we don't see AI, for example, in the inverted comma, curing cancer in the inverted comma, is because it turns out it's quite hard to do, and just throwing huge amounts of data at it on its own with nothing else isn't going to fix it. And so obviously we do see, and I think we see sort of maybe psychologically, people wanting AI to fix things that they believe that they themselves cannot fix, whereas they don't like AI coming in and fixing or doing things that they themselves can do, which is natural, but may start to address that, that sort of discrepancy between those two statements. I think also you've got to take into account the social aspect, so it's the regulation aspect of these things. So healthcare is rightly the most regulated industry. Turns out that when you're a very highly regulated industry, it's very hard to adopt very agile manner, very disruptive technology, which is one of the reasons this civic data cooperative is such a special thing, by the way. Plug alert. But when we look at instead advertising on, let's say, Facebook, that's a much less regulated space, and it turns out that people have jumped into that space because there's a less of a barrier to entry there. What can we do to address that? I think things like the Civic Data Cooperative are a great way to start, because it gives people the opportunity to understand that the barrier to entry is not insurmountable. That if you do things right, you can do amazing things, and those things can help address the kind of challenges that people want to see. I think we'll always see a close coupling between financial incentives and what people choose to spend their time on, which is why so many brilliant minds end up in finance, for example. But I think there are lots of things that the government, for example, could do, or the sectors could do, to start readdressing those outcomes. And I guess the other thing that I'll just say, which is, because here seems the most appropriate time to say it, we've already had a little touch on it, is for certain types of AI, the infrastructure is unimaginable. Facebook just bought 350,000 GPUs. The UK government put a target for their new national AI infrastructure at 2,000. That's quite a difference. And if you're going to have that mismatch in underlying capability, there's going to be a mismatch in what gets done. Addressing that mismatch, and if we're serious about wanting to be a superpower, we have to be serious about the way that we enable that to happen. So not only understanding that we need proper infrastructure that is accessible to anybody that has a good idea, but also understanding what that means in terms of how you physically construct these things, because turns out you can't just turn up to an empty warehouse and stuff 250,000 GPUs and it'd be good to go. That energy draw of these things is intense. Better investment in underlying energy infrastructure will help to spread and democratize the availability of putting these kind of resources together, which will then trickle down into the accessibility of people to be able to do the science.
So, I'm really interested. I think all industries have the potential to be impacted positively and negatively, but recent development, in particular, seem like they have a particular so they have an impact on anyone that is creating knowledge. So I would describe things like the creative industry, education, and ironically, I think even technology developers themselves. The act of creating something in your head. If you're one of those workers, something like ChatGPT, well, that is indicative of where programming, coding, developing a beautiful Gantt chart, or creating a diagram, or drafting a research paper could go. Now, I'm not a forecaster. I'm not telling you this is definitely where it will go, and I'm not pretending to be a forecaster. But I think that LLMs and SLMs, so language models, large language models, and small language models, present a particular challenge for anyone that, up until now, has been paid and rewarded and valued for things that they created in their head and made real in the world. So I think that that's actually a really, really large proportion of the UK economy, which rely on that kind of work. And I'm not sure we've quite got our head around that, and I don't think we've quite anticipated and planned for that. So that's, in my view, is very disruptive. I also think there's another angle here, which is some of what David was talking about around the service economy, and things like Uber drivers, who, right now, Uber drivers are driving on a network and they're benefiting, arguably not fully, as they should, from being on a network. But through the learning of the behavior and the data of Uber drivers, it's not a step too far away to imagine a world in which you have automated cars trained on the driving behavior of Uber drivers. And that's another challenge. So what I'm trying to do here is give you an example of two completely different ways in which completely different types of industries can be impacted around AI, and they both present challenges. Now, the debate is open as to what then happens with people. Do they then do other types of work? Do they work collaboratively? And I think that that's the piece that we haven't quite defined yet, but also I think it's the piece where we need to actually take a step back and say, this is a political question, and we need to make the decision about the right division of labour, rather than, let's just be resigned and let everything happen and react and respond, which is where we currently are.
As you mentioned also regulation at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
That's a key question, and that is a key question on where also technology that's developed in the private sector is taken up and is used and so on. And I mean, we can't expect the private sector alone to solve all these issues. All this happens within a regulatory framework, and that is key. And where incentives are set, and where regulations are stricter or where less stricter. You mentioned that, and there might be reasons for that. But then these things exactly have to be deliberated and thought about, and that is key in steering where technology is deployed.
I would add one thing to what you were saying, Arne, which is if you want to look at where AI is being adopted or will be adopted, all you have to look at are what are the values that are driving the primary actors, right? This is where the incentives question comes in. Well, I mean, if you look at the values that are driving the market, right, these are what we would recognize as values of efficiency, profit optimization, market share, right, the kind of consistent private sector values that have driven AI as a market force, right? The scholar Peter Dreyhaus talks about how potential public interest technology, potential addressing of public goods by technology has sort of faced what he called the tragedy of commodification over the last couple of centuries. And that's not just AI, but think about the potential for pharmaceuticals to address, you know, real world health issues around the globe, or, you know, other technologies that could have been game changing if there wasn't intellectual property law in the way it is. So I'm underlying this because when we look at displacement, labor displacement especially, there's not a set of values that are driving the reflexive choice to engage in the technological activity that's displacing people that would have asked the question, should we be doing this? Is this the society that we want to build together? Because those values aren't driving the behavior. And that's why this idea of incentives is so important. Because if you don't, in a sense, get to the root of what's driving the behavior, so you can change incentive structures to, you know, give tax benefit, for instance, to public interest technology or whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of different policy measures you can take, but if you don't get at the values and the incentives, you'll continue to have, you know, externalities like we've been talking about.